You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Friday evening, folks. Here it is, the end of another week. Another week in sequestration, isolation, quarantine, whatever you want to call it. Hopefully they're going to get things worked out eventually here, and we'll see where we're going. But all of this stuff leads to something I want to open up with, which is a little different from our main topic tonight. But first, this is Scotty Roberts. You are listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can go over to Odyssey Radio, check out all the locations where you can hear this show in its audio format on all the different platforms where they have it. And also come on over to my YouTube channel where you can watch the video version of this in simulcast with the audio on Odyssey and other outlets. I don't know why I stumbled over that. I know exactly what I'm saying. I've only said it every day for the last year. But come on over to my YouTube channel, see the video in simulcast, join the chat room, which is going on live right now during this broadcast. Meet all the other Intrepid family members over there and have a good time chatting up a storm during this program. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And of course, I do this for new listeners. You never know what night you're going to have new people listening. And I want to let everybody know where you can go, where you can find all the different places to hear this show. That's it. Boom. Now, before we get into our topic on the Exodus, I want to talk about something about division in our country. Now, granted, I broadcast in the United States, and the bulk of my listeners are U.S. citizens, but I have listeners all over the world. So some of this may not apply to you in your situations in your country, but I think it's a great civics lesson. Without getting into political divide and things like that, I want you to hear a little something. I've been reading this book, and I've been reading it slow but sure. I've got a stack of about 1,000 books I have to be reading. But this is one I keep coming back to. It's called Founding Fathers. It's by Joseph J. Ellis. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. And he's kind of subtitled it The Revolutionary Generation. So I want to read a passage that I took out of this book. And I put it up on my social media this morning, mostly because I have a lot of friends who are on vastly diametrically opposed ends of the political spectrum. And it creates a lot of argument, a lot of dialogue, sometimes heated, sometimes it's friendly. But I thought this was a good passage, and I want you, especially if you're a citizen of this country, to listen to this. Listen intently. And those of you who aren't, listen intently and enjoy it and glean what you can from this. But I have this post that I put up, and it's a section that I took out of this book. And I prefaced it by saying, for all my friends on diametrically opposed ends of the political spectrum, I found this passage in Joseph J. Ellis's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Founding Brothers, to be immensely profound. Now listen to this, folks. Consider this in the midst of all the political debating and all the rankling that goes back and forth, especially in social media. He said this: "It's truly humbling, perhaps even dispiriting, to realize that the historical debate over the Revolutionary Era and the early Republic merely recapitulates the ideological debate conducted at the time, that historians have essentially been fighting the same battles over and over again, that the revolutionary generation fought originally amongst themselves, though many historians have taken a compromise or split the difference over the ensuing years. The basic choice has remained constant, as historians have declared themselves Jeffersonians or Hamiltonians, committed to individualist or dedicated nationalists, liberals or conservatives, then written accounts that favor one camp or the other, or that stigmatize one side by viewing it through the eyes of the other, much as the contestants did back then. While we might be able to forestall the intellectual embarrassment by claiming that the underlying values at stake are timeless, and that the salient questions, classical in character, the awkward truth is that we have been chasing our own tails in an apparently endless cycle of partisan pleading. Perhaps because we're still living their legacy. We have yet to reach a genuinely historical perspective on the revolutionary generation. But again, in a way that Thomas Paine would tell us was commonsensical, and Jefferson could tell us was self-evident, both sides in the debate have legitimate claims at historical truth. On both sides speak for the deepest impulses of the American Revolution. With the American Revolution, as with all revolutions, different factions came together in common cause to overthrow the reigning regime, then discovered in the aftermath of their triumph that they had fundamentally different and politically incompatible notions of what they intended. In the dizzying sequence of events that compromised the political history of the 1790s, the full range of their disagreements was exposed, and their different agenda for the United States collided head-on. Taking sides in this debate is like choosing between the words and the music of the American Revolution. What distinguishes the American Revolution from most, if not all, subsequent revolutions worthy of the name, is that the battle for supremacy, for the true meaning of the revolution. Neither side completely triumphed. Here I do not mean that the American Revolution did not devour its own children and lead to blood-soaked scenes at the guillotine or the firing squad wall, though it's true enough. I mean that the revolutionary generation found a way to contain the explosive energies of the debate in a form of an ongoing argument or dialogue that was eventually institutionalized and rendered safe by the creation of the political parties. And the subsequent political history of the United States then became an oscillation between new versions of the old tension, which broke out in violence only on the occasion of the Civil War. In its most familiar form, dominant in the 19th century, the tension assumes a constitutional appearance as a conflict between state and federal sovereignty. The source of the disagreement goes much deeper, however, involving conflicting attitudes toward government itself, competing versions of citizenship, differing postures between the twin goals of freedom and liberty. But the key point is that the debate was not resolved so much as built into the fabric of our national identity. And there's so much more that he has to say about this, but I thought that was a very profound piece, and I wanted to share that with you today. We all have differences. We all have, and sometimes they grow to the insanely argumentative. But at the core, we're all after the same goal in this country. I think around the world in different ways and under different forms of government. We all want freedom. We all want liberty. We may disagree on how to get there, but I think the common cause is that everybody comes together to decide this is our common cause. We can debate the issues along the way, but this is where we are and this is what we need to focus on. And so I put that up for my friends, who are many of them diametrically opposed to my politics, and I perhaps to theirs. But we still maintain at the core the fact that we are all friends, the fact that we respect each other, and the fact that we have common goals, although different routes to get there, with perhaps different end results in the implementation of those same freedoms and those liberties. So I want to leave you all with that, especially if you're a citizen of this country, the United States. Those of you who listen all over the world to this show, Australia, New Zealand, England, Germany, France, Africa, all those different places that tune into this show. I want to thank you for being here and putting up with a little of my own nationalism, if you will, and addressing the debate that's constantly going on here. We see it even now with the whole pandemic viral infection thing and how to deal with it. And so it's out there, folks. But there you go. Take that or leave it. Now let's get into what we wanted to talk about tonight. I'm talking about, of course, the Exodus. And I'm going to try to wrap this up tonight. But I want to jump a little bit back and forth, and of course I have a ton of information out in front of me. Yesterday we left off examining some of these cities from an archaeological point of view. And the reason I did that was to say there is a story of fact at the core of all of this. And all the debate around it rises from sometimes just leaning back casually on generally accepted dates, generally accepted points of view on things. And many of those points of view are wrapped around, well, the Bible's fallacy, the Bible's a storybook, the Bible doesn't give us accurate history, and so we're just going to, push that aside over here. The problem is that they have not done their research. Now, I haven't been the person who's been out there digging holes and looking for stuff in these sites, but there have been good archaeologists that have found information that contradicts the generally accepted date. And the generally accepted date of the Exodus and the conquest subsequent was around the 1220s to the 1230s BCE, which would have placed it in and after the reign of Ramses II, which is where all the storybooks have gone, all the stories we hear, all the information it's Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. The problem is he wasn't, and that he was about 200 years too late on the time scale. And we've gone through and established that by showing some of the thick, sometimes murky waters of wading through some of this archaeology. And there's a little bit of that left I'm going to hit on tonight. But we have to sum up the argument so far. I've proposed that 1, a return to the biblical date for the conquest of Canaan is where the facts lie. 2, a lowering of the date for the end of the Middle Bronze Age from 1550 BC to shortly before 1400 BCE. And the result of that 2 events, previously separated by centuries, are brought together. The fall of Canaan's Middle Bronze Age 2 cities becomes the archaeological evidence for the conquest. These twin proposals create an almost perfect match between the archaeological evidence and the biblical account. And that is rare when you can come to within so few handfuls of years to bringing historical events to match a biblical event. Boom, they mesh together. And the only outstanding anomaly is the city of Ai, because of the lack of Middle Bronze II remains at El Tel. But even this problem is removed by the further proposal that Ai should be relocated. It's not where they think it is. And if you put it where it actually is, everything starts to mesh. And that's the one anomaly in the whole argument. And still we need to show, however, that the end of the Middle Bronze Age should be redated by over a century. There are 2 questions here. Why has the end of the Middle Bronze been dated to about 1550 BCE? And is there any independent evidence for that drastic reduction in the date? And the answer to the first is that the end of the Middle Bronze II has been fixed at about 1550 BCE. This would place the end of the Middle Bronze about 100 years before the biblical dating of the Exodus, what I think has been a proven date of the Exodus, by its association with an event in Egyptian history. And so as we've seen, the end of the MB2 is marked by widespread destruction and abandonment of major Canaanite cities. The destroyers of these cities have conveniently been identified as the Egyptians, pursuing their Hyksos overlords after driving them out of Egypt. And the date, and by the way, the Hyksos, I would modify that to say not so much their overlords as they were the ones who took over the northern kingdom for about 100 years. And so it was like a civil war, but not really, because these were all the peoples who had moved in from the Canaanite region for hundreds of years, filtering into the Nile Delta and assimilating into the cities, and they eventually just took over the northern kingdom. And so there was a divided kingdom until Ahmose I drove them out in the 1500s BCE. And so the date for the expulsion of the Hyksos and the beginning of the new dynasty of the native kings, the 18th dynasty, is fixed by Egyptologists around 1550 BC. Now, hence, this has become the date for the fall of Canaan's MB2 cities, and therefore the date when the Middle Bronze Age ended and the Late Bronze Age began. But recently now, scholars have become increasingly critical of attributing the destruction of all these sites to the Egyptians. We're now beginning to realize that the evidence for an Egyptian destruction is really very scanty, and a few scraps of inscriptional evidence which are suggestive at best. And furthermore, the prominent Egyptologist Donald Redford has recently pointed out that at the start of the 18th dynasty, the first Egyptian dynasty after the expulsion of the Hyksos, the Egyptians were simply not capable of besieging fortified cities throughout Canaan. Noting the lack of evidence for such Egyptian campaigns in Canaan, William H. Shea, S-H-E-A, has also written of the need to find alternative destroyers for the Middle Bronze Age II cities in Canaan. Now, if the Egyptians weren't the destroyers of these cities at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, their destruction may well have occurred later than 1550 BCE. And indeed, there's now really strong evidence for placing the end of the Middle Bronze II much later than the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt. And the evidence comes from recent excavations in Egypt. Manfred Bietak of the Institute of Archaeology of the University of Vienna and the Austrian Archaeological Institute has been conducting excavations at a site called Tel El Daba since 1966. This is a mound in the Katana Katir district, that is, the region of the biblical Ramesses, Pi-Ramses. And here Bietak found Middle Bronze Syro-Canaanite pottery associated with the Egyptian finds of the Hyksos era. After analyzing this material, Bietak has suggested that the period known as the Middle Bronze II-B, one of the three subdivisions of the Middle Bronze Age, be lowered by roughly a century. Instead of the Middle Bronze II's conventional dates of 1750 to 1650 BCE, he proposes 1650 to 1750, or 1570, This, in turn, displaces the final phase of the Middle Bronze II, known as MB2C, which must now start around 1570 BCE instead of 1650. And so 100 years later, as was previously held. And in light of this, the conventional end date, and here's the key, namely 1550 BC, cannot be retained. Even the later end date of about 1500 BC, now favored by some archaeologists, is impossibly early. And in light of that evidence from Tel El Daba, we must lower the date for the end of the MB2C period, the last phase of Middle Bronze II, and the period of the destruction of the Canaanite cities well into the 15th century BCE. But the question arises, can we be more precise than that? Are you seeing the importance of understanding all this technical data around placing the dates? Because the dates will tell you whether or not the biblical account has historical efficacy. Now, we're not trying to move the dates around for the purpose of acquiescing to a biblical date. And by biblical, I don't necessarily mean spiritual or religious. I'm talking about the information contained historically in the pages of the Old Testament. So helpful evidence for dating the end of the MB2 comes from Shechem in Canaan itself. At the city of Shechem, 4 major building phases have been dated to MB2C. As Dame Kathleen Kenyon pointed out, it seems impossible to compress all these 4 building phases into the time normally allowed for the period, 1650 to 1550 BCE. Her solution was to assign the last building phase to the late Bronze Age instead, but the attribution of all 4 phases to the Middle Bronze, 2C, is now proven beyond doubt, and the phasing is therefore described by William G. Deaver as tight. So logically, rather than compress the MB2C into less than the century generally allotted to it, we should allow it to considerably be a longer period of time. Indeed, some archaeologists are now inclined to allow about 150 years for the period. Combining this length of time with Baituk's new data of about 1570, and I don't expect, there's not going to be a test, I'm just giving you this information so it comes into your head and hopefully lodges and bounces around for a bit, we arrive at the date of about 1420 BCE for the end of the Middle Bronze Era. And these are the dates that we provisionally propose for the MB2C. Here, all this information. So, thus, about 1420 BCE becomes the suggested date for the Israelite conquest of Canaan. The Exodus should be placed 40 years earlier, around 1460 BCE, and this is in harmony with the biblical data. Now, finally, I want to forestall 2 objections which may be leveled at this reconstruction. I've suggested that the destruction of Canaanite cities at the end of the Middle Bronze Age represents the Israelite conquest of Canaan after the Exodus. But a number of sites were destroyed at this time that the Bible doesn't even mention. In the Bible, only 14 cities are said to have been conquered by Israel, though 31 defeated kings are listed in Joshua 12. So they didn't give you a complete list of the cities, whereas almost 40 cities were destroyed or abandoned at the Middle Bronze, Late Bronze transition. Now, it's not difficult, however, to account for these surplus destructions within the framework we're proposing. There are 3 possibilities which should be seen as complementary rather than mutually exclusive. First, cities that fell at the time but that are not said to have been taken by the Israelites could have been destroyed by Egyptian campaigns. Tutmosis III, 1490 to 36 BC, and Tutmosis IV, 1412 to 1402, both campaigned in Canaan, and some of the surplus destructions may perhaps be attributed to them. Second, cities not mentioned in the conquest traditions may nevertheless have been destroyed by the Israelites, since the biblical account is probably not a comprehensive list. So in the book of Joshua mentions the defeat of the kings of Tapua and Tirzah, both in the central hill country of what is now Israel, though no battles in that region are described in either Joshua or in the first chapter of the book of Judges. So third, some cities may have been overthrown by Canaanite elements making common cause with Israelites, or at least exploiting the upheaval that the invaders brought that capitulated to Israel, and in order to purpose their own ends, and probably their own survival. And so the conquest traditions make it plain that some elements in Canaan did align themselves with the Israelites. Joshua and Judges both attest to this. And while the peasant revolt theory of Israel's origins has overstressed this aspect, it can't be left out of the account altogether. And you know what? We got to end there for the first segment. We're at the end of our time. We're going to go out to break. Sit tight. We got more of this fascinating information to regale you with when we come back. Sit tight. Welcome back, folks, from that break. This is Scotty Roberts, and if you're new to the second segment tonight, you're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can come on over and watch the video simulcast of this show right over on my YouTube channel and join the live chat room with the other Intrepids going on right now live as this show is playing. And that is over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, welcome back to this segment. We're going to jump just right back into this. We left off, we were talking about some of the theories of why the Middle Bronze Age period had to end and all that technical archaeological data, historical data, necessary to establish why the biblical dating system seems to be the accurate dates for the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. So now some of you might not know anything about this or even care about this. Most of us who have heard anything about Moses and the Exodus, that's about where it ends. It was always Ramses was the Pharaoh, which we found is not the right date for the Exodus. 200 years too late. And so now we're looking at why we can say that with certainty and then uncover the facts of this. So another problem, as we left off at the end of the first segment, that may be posed to the revised chronology is that the enormous increase in hill country settlements in Canaan, which has conveniently been identified with the coming of the Israelites. But that didn't occur until about 1200 BCE, where our critics might ask, is the evidence for Israel's presence? Where is the evidence for Israel's presence in the land after the MB2 destruction, Middle Bronze II, of about 1420 BC and before 1200 BC? Now, the Israelites had lived in Egypt as enslaved pastoralists, and they spent about 40 years as semi-nomads before entering Canaan, between the Exodus and the conquest. And this makes it unlikely that they brought a distinctive material culture into Canaan. They would have bought their pottery at the local Canaanite markets, so there would be no distinctively Israelite pottery during this period. They arrived as tent dwellers. Joshua 3:7-22 and all of that tells us that. And that lifestyle was probably maintained for a considerable time by those who were not assimilated into Canaanite society. Recent work by Rivka Gonen shows that the MP2 destruction were followed by a period of reduced urban population, while cave burials away from the cities seem to indicate a presence of a significant semi-nomadic population. In direct evidence such as this, we can expect to find Israel's arrival in Canaan reflected. It's a mistake to expect the sudden appearance of a distinctive foreign material culture to mark the event. And something else that's very interesting in this is that you remember the tabernacle of the covenant that was built in the wilderness in Sinai during that 40 years of semi-nomadic wandering by Israel, that instead of building a temple anywhere, they built the tabernacle of the covenant, which was a tented temple, so to speak. So it was mobile, could move around with them. And it really reflected the exact dimensions of the temple itself. Not the whole temple compound, but the temple itself, with the big tent on the outside, the middle tent called the Holy Place, and inside the Holy Place, a veil that divided off the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant sat, and the presence of God, the Shekinah glory of God, supposedly resided. And they had all the implements out there, the laver for washing, the altar for sacrifice, the candlesticks and all of that, the menorah, if you will. And so this was the mobile temple. This is what they had. And when they entered Israel, or Canaan, and started the conquest around 1400 BCE, remember, Solomon didn't build the temple for almost over 400 years later before they built a brick and mortar temple. They still used this tabernacle of the covenant, this tent, as the place for the Ark of the Covenant and the holy place and the high priests and all of that for 400 years. And so this is the kind of settlement you had by the Israelites in Canaan even after the conquest. So the Israelites had lived in Egypt as enslaved pastoralists. And they spent 40 years as these nomads. And they would have done the same once they entered Canaan. They did not refortify and rebuild these cities except over a period of time. As indirect evidence such as this, we can expect to find Israel's arrival in Canaan reflected. And it's a mistake to expect that the sudden appearance of Israel in Canaan was a distinctive foreign material culture that marks the event of the end of the Middle Bronze II period. Now, at the end of the Late Bronze Age and the start of the Iron Age, around 1200 BCE, a major change occurred in the settlement patterns, with new settlements appearing in the hill country areas. Now remember, when we talked about David and King David, in that series I talked about how David, when he was consolidating his power in Israel to become the king, he had to go to all these little fortified hill cities all around Judah. And he had to go, and same in Israel. And they still had all these little towns and cities that popped up all over the place, smattered throughout the hill country. And that's today excavations that are going on in Israel, are all these little fort cities, these little fortified towns that were scattered all over the hill country. And so, but a major change occurred in the settlement patterns, with all these little towns popping up all over the place. And contrary to the views of some earlier scholars, these are not evidence of nomadic groups beginning to settle down. In opposition, or in the opinion of most scholars today, the new settlements that were all over the hill country mark a shift of the existing population away from the old lowland cities of the Bronze Age. And the shift was made possible by new technological developments, including iron tools for clearing forests and slaked lime cisterns for storing water. And while we don't believe that the new settlements mark the arrival of the Israelites, we're still happy to call them Israelite settlements. And this is because, in my view, the Israelites had been in the land for some 2 centuries by the time 1200 BCE hits, and are therefore involved in the changes that took place at that time. Now, I wouldn't claim that the proposed 15th century chronology for the Exodus and conquest is entirely without its own problems. What I do say is that the entire proposal presents far fewer problems than the conventional or the GAD, the generally accepted dates of the 13th century chronology. And as I noted earlier, James B. Pritchard wrote in the 1960s that scholarship had reached an impasse on the question of supporting the traditional view of the conquest with archaeological undergirding. And so the response to the impasse has been to reconstruct Israel's origins in ways that don't involve the biblical picture of a conquest at all. But this just simply won't do. As Abraham Malamut observed, a basic element of Israelite consciousness is that Canaan was inherited, quote-unquote, by force. And this tenet is like a leitmotif that runs through the biblical sources. So consequently, Malamut states that even though some embellishment of the account may have occurred, at a core, a military conquest remains. And we believe that the revised chronology we proposed does justice to both the biblical picture of the conquest and the archaeological record. And I offer that to you now as that alternative to be explored. And this is why there is so much technical data that needs to be looked at when you're trying to establish these dates. And I think that that's been done very well. So, I want to show you something here. And those of you, I'm sorry, in Radio Land, you're not going to be able to see this graphic I put up, but of course I will talk all the way through it and I'll describe it to you. This is my chronology which varies just a little bit on the dates by a year here, a few years there, and so on, a handful of things. But it's all fits right within this framework that we've just taken 3 days to establish. Now, this is a slide from my presentation. It's part of a PowerPoint on the Nephilim issue when I was speaking on this. And I focused on Hatshepsut because I was establishing certain things about Egyptian history. And in that, I took the opportunity to present for the first time my view of the dating system for the Exodus. Now, I've got here, this is an illustration I did of Hatshepsut many years ago. It was for my book on the Nephilim and for this information and this data that I included in that book. And so I did this particular illustration of her. She uncannily ended up looking a bit like Angelina Jolie. I don't know why. That's just a mental thing. Artists do that. You draw pictures and sometimes you sit back and go, hey, that looks like so-and-so. How did that happen? So anyway, Hatshepsut. And I was working to establish her date and how she fit into the Exodus story. Now, in 966 BC to 967 BC, that whole the dating of the building of the Temple of Solomon starts. We focus on 966 BCE. Now, give or take, as I've always said, 3 to 7 years in either direction. So there's some wobble room there. But 966 to 967, or should we say that backwards, 967 to 966 BCE is the generally accepted date of the building of the temple, or at least the start of the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And it says in 1 Kings 6:1, and we've read this verse before, that Solomon began the construction of his temple in Jerusalem 480 years after the Exodus took place. Now, that's a well-rounded number, as we talked about yesterday. So it's probably a fudged number or just a rounded-up number. And it places the Exodus, if this is indeed a factual statement, it places the Exodus, as you can see as I've got on the chart here, 480 years earlier than 966 BC is 1446 BC. 1446, 1447, or as we've rounded the numbers, 1450-ish BCE. And so the Exodus. Now I want you to look at some dates here. In 1447, a year earlier than this, or right in the middle of this, Amenhotep II was the pharaoh on the throne of Egypt, not Ramses. Ramses was 200 years later. Now, look at this timeline I've got here. Amenhotep II, 1447. Now, he was a very young man. He came to the throne at the age of 18, which wasn't so young back then. But he came to the throne at age 18 as a co-regent with his father, Thutmose III, who you've heard me talk about before. Thutmose III was the stepson of Hatshepsut. He was a harem child by her brother, her husband, at the time, Thutmose II. Hatshepsut and Thutmose II had one child together. He was the Princess Nefruri. And you've seen here, let me click this off for a second. You can see in this sculpture behind me, this bust of Senenmut. And this is it's a replica, but this is Senenmut, the Grand Vizier, underneath Hatshepsut, and this is Nefruri, her daughter. And Hatshepsut made Senenmut the tutor to the royal daughter. Now keep in mind, royal tutors back then, and I've mentioned this before, they weren't school marms, wet behind the ears, all of that. They were generally always someone of high nobility or someone who had been a general in the armies and been raised to high nobility and so on. And as we know about Senenmut, Hatshepsut bestowed on him 92 royal titles during his lifetime, and even his name, Senenmut, which means mother's brother. I, your mother, am elevating you to the status of brother to the gods with me. Now, it's recorded in Egyptian history, Hatshepsut only had one kid, and that was Nefruri, the young princess, whom Senenmut, we know historically, the man, was, one of his duties was to be the tutor to the royal daughter, who died very young age. They say sometime between 11 years old and 16 years old. But Hatshepsut and Thutmose II had no other children. So Senenmut, he's her son. I, your mother, elevate you to the status of brother to the gods with me. Is that because Hatshepsut may very well have been the young girl who found Moses in the Nile in the basket? And that because she found him in the Nile in the basket, she wanted to adopt him, according to the biblical story, sent him back to his mother because Moses' older sister Miriam had been following the basket, probably placed it there on purpose to save his life. And the Pharaoh's daughter, Matkare at the time, who later became Hatshepsut with her regnal name, she was too young and she sent the child back to have him weaned until she was old enough to claim him. And then we don't see that event in the biblical story, but the next event, of course, is Moses. He's 40 in the biblical account. And it doesn't mention any of these names. But if this is indeed Moses, the man, we don't know his birth name, Senenmut's birth name, but we do know it's a name that Hatshepsut gave to this man, along with all these 92 other royal titles, one of them being Grand Vizier, which was Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. So if this is indeed the young woman who had aged between 7 and 10 years old, found Moses in the Nile, she eventually brought him back into the royal palace, raised him as a noble, as a son of the Pharaoh, if you will. He got his education in the school of the nobles, and for 40 years lived as a nobleman in Egypt, connected to the royal palace and the pharaonic family. And this is the guy, and she named him Senenmut to indicate, I, your mother, him elevating you to the status of brother to the gods. Some have passed this off simply as Hatshepsut, the mother of Egypt. She was the god, she was the pharaoh. But at the same time, remember, Hatshepsut was somebody who needed to identify as a male in the role. She wore the king's clothing, the male clothing, the little beard, the fake beard, all of this to signify that she was a woman in the man's role. And this is what she did to establish her power. But when she elevates Senenmut, she doesn't say, I, the Pharaoh, am elevated. She says, I, your mother. Mother. Some have said that it's because she was the mother of Egypt. I believe it's because she was indeed his stepmother and elevated him to this status. Now, I don't know what kind of relationship they had as stepmother, stepson, but there's also vast amounts of Egyptian history that state that Senenmut and Hatshepsut also became lovers. And maybe that's one of the reasons why. She knew he wasn't flesh and blood. She raised this guy. She was about 10 years older than he was. Raised him. Maybe fell in love with him. I think it's very evident from many different things that showed they were in love with each other. And she elevated him, and she gave him this title maybe in part to say, I'm not your mom, but you're equal to the gods with me. You're my brother to the gods, and now we can do the nasty. We can shag. I don't know if that was the reason. That's just pure comic speculation. But this was the guy. Now, getting back to this chart that I made up, you can see here that in 1446, I've got the date of the Exodus under Amenhotep II. And 1447 is his regnal date. And then we've got before him let's see, when did he start his reign? About 1493 to 1450, you've got Thutmose III. Now you can see how he overlapped with Amenhotep II, his son. So Thutmose III was probably in his very early 80s when he died, but he was co-regent for about 3 years with his son, Amenhotep II. Now Thutmose III was, in a sense, the stepbrother to Moses, if Hatshepsut was claiming him as her son. Thutmose III was not Hatshepsut's flesh and blood son, but her stepson. He was born to a harem wife of her husband, brother, Thutmose II. And when Thutmose II died, Thutmose III was about 3 years oldish, in that range, too young to rule as a pharaoh. So Hatshepsut took the power. She became co-regent with him and then reigned for over 21 to 25 years. in Egypt. And it was during that period that she also raised Senenmut, brought him into her household. And I believe that she gave him the name Senenmut. And I believe that all of this took place to establish who Moses became in the early 40 years of his life. And then, of course, we have the story that Moses murdered the Egyptian taskmaster, and he fled Egypt at around age 40. Now, it's very interesting that Senenmut disappears off the Egyptian scene around age 40. Here he is, the grand vizier, the grand royal architect, the high priest of Mamun, 90 other titles given to him by Hatshepsut, and he just disappears off the scene around age 40. He has 2 glorious tombs, both of them unfinished and unoccupied. And yet he disappears, and there's not a word of whatever happened to him. He disappears off the scene. But I believe that there's not much history left about him, because he re-emerged 40 years later as Moses, his birth name, not Senenmut, as Moses, and returns to Egypt to free the slaves in around 1447 to 1446 BCE, when he's about 80 years old. So he's had 2 lifetimes, 40 in Egypt, now 40 in Midian as an expat, and now he's come back under the instructions of God, and in 1447 to 1446. Now, before Tutmosis III, you see 1486 I've got in there as the date that Moses would have murdered and fled Egypt. And this was during the reign of Hatshepsut, who dies a very short time afterwards. And Tutmosis II's reign, Hatshepsut's husband, ended about 10 years or so before Moses becomes the murderer. And in 1513 is where we have Tutmosis I ordered the death of the Hebrew babies, and in 1526 is where we have the birth of Moses, found by Hatshepsut. By the way, it wasn't 1513, that was the end of his reign. And this is the Pharaoh who would have ordered the death of all the baby boys of the Hebrew slaves thrown in the Nile. And that was 1526. And in 1526, Tutmosis I was on the throne, and his daughter was Hatshepsut, known as Matkari by her birth name. And she would have been at 7 to 10 years old at the time. And the interesting thing about her, the Bible refers to as the woman who found Moses in the Nile in his basket was Pharaoh's daughter. And I think this is the one homage that Moses may have paid to the names, is that Pharaoh's daughter wasn't just who she was, it was what she was. It was a title. It was an official title, like Your Majesty, things like that. She was Pharaoh's daughter. That was a title at the time. And the only daughter, the only child that Tutmosis I had, who was a girl, and who was, or a young woman, if you will, who bore the title of Pharaoh's daughter, was Hatshepsut, Matkari Hatshepsut. And so the timeline plays out there. You see how Moses would have been born into the reign of Tutmosis I. And the whole argument of, and I've heard scholars argue this, well, that didn't really happen, the whole putting the baby in the basket and floating him down the Nile. All that is a retelling of the Osiris story when he's floated down the Nile in a basket, or baskets. And he's cut into pieces and then reassembled and so on by the gods. But I believe, my theory is this, and I stated this the other day in the closing minutes here of this show, is that Moses' mom, remember, the Israelites by now are Egyptian, basically. They're foreign slaves, but they're Egyptianized. There is no Jewish nation, there's no Jewish religion even at this time, although there's a proto-religion that existed before that. They were so Egyptianized that they knew all these stories and these tales and these legends, the Egyptian gods. Look at the golden calf story. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were building a representation of Hathor, the Egyptian goddess. And so Moses' mom probably knew all about the story of Osiris and the basket in the Nile. And remember, it doesn't say that she put him in the basket and floated him down the vast expanse of the Nile. He'd have been eaten by crocodiles. It says that she placed him amongst the reeds on the shore, on the bank of the Nile, right where the Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. And I believe this is, they cut all these canals through Upper Egypt in Memphis, and I believe this is where this story took place, and it was off one of the canals that went directly into the royal compound, and this is where the princess bathed. And so Moses' mom, knowing the legend, the myth, replicated it for the sake of having the Pharaoh's daughter or somebody there at the palace take Moses out of the basket and honor him in that way. And that's what I think happened. That's where this guy came from, Senenmut. All Egyptian history tells us of his roots is that he was born of commoners. Slaves? Maybe. So the Exodus, I believe, took place in 1446 BC, the conquest around 1400 BC. Ramesses is 200 years too late. And folks, we're done. We're out of time for tonight. You have a good weekend. On Sunday morning, join me right here at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. West Coast for It's Sunday. Not part of the official Odyssey Radio broadcast show, but here just my live chat that goes on Sunday mornings. We'll see you here. Have a great weekend.